Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome back, everyone, to our latest explainer. Today is actually a huge milestone for us. Day 24, the architecture review. Up until now, it's been so incredibly easy to get entirely caught up in the micro details. I mean, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Obsessing over optimizing that one single database query or maybe refactoring a helper function for the fifth time. Guilty as charged. But today, we're taking a massive step back. Day 24 is all about elevating our perspective. We're shifting away from those microscopic lines of text and looking at the overarching macro-level systems. Because honestly, those are what actually dictate whether a project lives or dies. Look, beyond code. Three simple words, right? But they demand a fundamental pivot in how you evaluate a project. Because if you're only reviewing the code itself, well, you're missing the forest for the trees. The syntax, that's literally just the surface layer. The real challenge for us here is to break completely out of that tunnel vision. We have to start looking at the massive structure that actually surrounds all those individual lines.
Think about it. When you hyper-focus purely on code, you're really only seeing how a specific microtask is executed, which kind of leaves you totally blind to the bigger picture. But architecture, the structural foundation, that's what matters most. So why exactly is it such a trap to ignore that structural skeleton? Well, because if the architecture is flawed, if the very skeleton of your system is just fundamentally broken, it genuinely doesn't matter how beautiful or elegant the code itself is. A perfectly written function sitting inside a chaotic, crumbling architecture, it's still going to fail every single time.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it brings us to the first major thematic bucket of our review, the blueprint. Before you inspect the logic of a single function, you really have to step back and look at the overarching physical organization of the entire project. It's kind of like walking onto a construction site. Before you go checking the electrical wiring or critiquing the paint job on the walls, you look at the blueprint. You absolutely need to understand the big picture structure and exactly how different areas are carefully separated from one another. Which brings us to the very first pillar of this blueprint, folder structure. And I want you to really genuinely ask yourself right now, what does your folder structure actually reveal about your system? Does it instantly communicate your business domain, or does it just blindly parrot the framework you're using? It sounds basic, I know, but it's incredibly powerful. When a brand new developer opens your project repository for the very first time, does that structure instantly tell a clear, logical story of what the application does? A well-organized structure isn't just about tidiness. Actually, scratch that. It's not about tidiness at all. It's the absolute primary way your architecture communicates its intent to literally anyone who looks at it. And that structural intent leads us directly into our next concept, layer separation. Listen, this is profoundly important. When we review architecture, we are actively looking for strict, non-negotiable boundaries. Layer separation is the practice of keeping the functional, logical areas of your software completely isolated from one another. Like the code that fetches user data from your database, it should absolutely never be tangled up with the UI code that's rendering a shiny green button. It's exactly like a house. You want to be able to completely swap out the underlying plumbing without having to, tear down the entire roof just to do it. And this brilliantly illustrates what a healthy system looks like. The architecture is broken down into cleanly separated layers that simply don't bleed into one another. You really want to see distinct, secure boundaries. Every single section has its own dedicated job, rather than just being a tangled, interwoven mess of spaghetti code, where pulling on one tiny string accidentally collapses the entire application. When you sit down to do your Day 24 architecture review, ensuring each layer has its own secure space, well, that's exactly what you're verifying.
But here's the kicker. Physical organization, that's really only half the battle. You might have the absolute most beautiful folders in the world, but if they're secretly gossiping with each other behind the scenes, you have a major problem. So we now need to shift our thematic focus from the physical blueprint to what I like to call the invisible web. Because once you finally have your folder structured and your layers beautifully separated, you absolutely must understand how they actually talk to each other.
And that is our third critical pillar, dependencies. Looking beyond the code means you've got to map out exactly how these distinct layers interact. Are they interacting safely through well-defined channels? Or are they dangerously tightly coupled? Think about it. If your pristine layer A secretly relies on some hidden function buried deep inside layer C, your folder structure is basically a lie. An architecture review absolutely requires you to trace these invisible lines and ensure that your entire system isn't just locked in a super fragile web of unintended connections. Now, as we round out this explainer, we pivot to the final thematic bucket, which is really all about the future of the software. It all ultimately comes down to this massive test of everything we've just covered. Is it scalable and maintainable? This is the core question you've got to ask yourself when reviewing architecture. Because honestly, it doesn't matter if the system works perfectly right this very second. The real test of an architecture review is whether or not the system is fully prepared to survive tomorrow. So, the crucial point is scalability. This is a completely non-negotiable core requirement for any system that's going to grow and handle more load over time. When we look at scalability in our Day 24 review, we're basically asking a very direct, slightly terrifying question. Can this architecture handle a massive viral spike in traffic tomorrow morning? If the overarching design can't stretch and scale without requiring some painful, frantic rewrite from scratch, then the architecture has completely failed its review, regardless of how beautiful the individual lines of code might be. And standing right beside scalability is our final pillar, maintainability. Guys, maintainability is the absolute ultimate proof of a healthy system. It basically means that a year from now, when the original author has totally moved on, a brand new developer can hop in, navigate the structure, trace the dependencies, and fix a bug without accidentally taking down the entire login page. That is the ultimate test of a system's longevity. It proves that you actually successfully looked beyond the code to build something that lasts. Let's move to and see how this builds, right? When we pull it all together, the Day 24 review forms this really cohesive, unshakable progression. We start our review at step 1, examining the physical narrative through the folder structure. Then we enforce strict boundaries in step 2 with layer separation. We carefully map out the invisible web of interactions in step 3 by checking those dependencies. And finally, we stress test the entire future of the project by evaluating step 4, scalability, and step 5, maintainability. Each step just logically builds upon the last one to give you a truly complete architectural picture. Which brings us to the end of our explainer. We've laid out the blueprint, we've carefully traced the invisible web, and we've properly pressure tested the future. So I really want to leave you with this final provocative thought to take into your work today. Think about your daily habits. Think about your daily focus. Tomorrow, when you sit down at your screen, grab your coffee, and begin your work, will you still only look at the code?